By now, the weight of what I had discovered had settled deep inside me. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a living, breathing presence that shadowed every moment of my day. Yet, beneath the heartbreak and anger, a new sense of purpose had emerged. I knew that patience was my ally, and subtlety was my weapon. Confrontation would come later, but before that, I needed to escalate the consequences of her actions, quietly, invisibly, in ways that would make the truth impossible to ignore. I began by watching her more closely than ever. Every detail mattered. The way she held herself when she thought no one was looking, the almost imperceptible tension in her posture, the slight hesitation when responding to questions I had asked countless times. I observed her habits, her routines, and the way she tried to control her interactions. And I cataloged everything. Each subtle slip, each micro-expression, each tiny inconsistency was another thread I could use to weave the narrative of truth. It started with small, everyday situations. I would casually ask her about her day, her friends, or past experiences, and I paid attention to how she responded. The smallest hesitation, the faintest flicker of guilt or anxiety, became a signal. She didn't realize that I was no longer just a husband. I had become a silent observer, a strategist, and a judge of the inconsistencies in her carefully maintained story. Her social circle unknowingly began to play a role. Friends who had been around for years noticed things I'd already seen. The way she avoided certain topics, the subtle contradictions in her stories, the nervous laughter at memories she claimed were hers alone. I didn't have to push them. The truth was revealing itself naturally, through her own behavior, and I watched it all, silently noting how each small revelation added weight to the inevitability of exposure. Then came the first deliberate psychological tests. I would casually reference places she had said she visited with me, events she had recounted differently, or shared moments from months ago. I did it without accusation, without anger, simply observation. Her reactions were always telling. A slight twitch, a momentary pause, a nervous smile. She tried to mask them, but the cracks were widening. I let the moments linger, like a shadow that refuses to be ignored. One evening, for instance, I arranged a casual dinner with a few close friends who had known us both for years. The conversation drifted toward past trips, shared experiences, and mutual acquaintances. I watched her carefully. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and occasionally glanced at her phone with that same nervous energy I had grown accustomed to observing. Nothing was forced, nothing confrontational, but everything was revealing. The next step was to escalate the subtle pressure. I began introducing small, controlled challenges to her stories. I would ask about minor details of events she had recounted, mention interactions that she had previously left out, and observe how she adjusted her responses. Sometimes she would stumble over words, overcompensate with exaggerated expressions, or attempt to redirect the conversation entirely. Each reaction was a confirmation, a small victory, a step closer to clarity. At the same time, I continued documenting everything meticulously. Every message, every interaction, every pattern became part of a detailed record. I wasn't just collecting evidence for a confrontation. I was building a map of her deception, a story that would soon unfold with undeniable clarity. Every slip, every hesitation, every subtle sign of anxiety was a piece of the puzzle. And the more I observed, the more certain I became. The day of revelation was approaching. One afternoon, I decided to test her reactions to him more directly, but still subtly. I mentioned his name casually during a conversation, almost as if it were irrelevant. The moment I spoke it, I noticed the change in her demeanor. Her eyes flickered, her hands tightened slightly, and her voice wavered for just a fraction of a second. She forced a laugh, brushed it off, and moved on. But I had seen everything. That fleeting moment told me more than any confession ever could. I also began using social gatherings strategically. Casual dinners, coffee meetups, small parties, all became opportunities to create moments where her deception might slip. I let friends and family ask questions, make observations, or recall events, all under the guise of normal conversation. Each interaction became a mirror reflecting the inconsistencies in her narrative, and she had no idea that the people around her were now unwitting participants in the unveiling of her secrets. As the weeks passed, the psychological pressure began to accumulate. She was increasingly anxious, subtly defensive, and constantly aware that something was off, but unsure what. Her confident facade was cracking. Small mistakes, minor lies, and micro-expressions that once went unnoticed were now magnified in my observation. The tension she had been maintaining for months was unraveling, and it was a slow, almost poetic process to witness. I remember one evening particularly clearly. She had returned from a gathering with friends, visibly exhausted. I asked her about the event casually, and she began recounting stories, but inconsistencies immediately appeared. I let her speak, nodding occasionally, asking minor clarifying questions that seemed innocent. Each hesitation, each over-explained detail, each subtle shift in posture was evidence. She didn't know that I was quietly compiling the final pieces of the story that would soon be revealed. At the same time, I maintained my calm exterior, smiling, attentive, affectionate. I had to be convincing. Any hint of suspicion or anger would have triggered defensiveness, made her more careful, and potentially delayed the inevitable exposure. I had to allow her to continue her patterns, to maintain her routines, to reveal herself without realizing she was doing so. It was an intricate psychological dance, and patience was everything. I also orchestrated minor coincidences that pushed her toward revealing more of her double life. A casually mentioned event, a friend dropping by unexpectedly, a shared memory brought up in conversation. All of these were opportunities to observe her reactions. Every reaction mattered, no matter how small, and every subtle slip, every moment of anxiety, every twitch of the eyes added to the undeniable truth that was building. One evening, I introduced a small challenge. A friend casually asked about a trip she had taken, something she had told me in detail, but had left out in conversation with others. She froze for a moment, adjusted her response, and quickly glossed over the detail. But the hesitation was unmistakable. I could see it in her hands, her posture, her fleeting expressions. That tiny slip confirmed what I had suspected all along. Her carefully constructed web of deception was beginning to unravel under the weight of subtle consequences. Over the following days, I continued this methodical approach. Every interaction was an opportunity. Every conversation was a chance to observe. Every smile a possible crack in her composure. I watched her carefully, cataloged the nuances, and patiently waited for the moment when the cumulative effect of these pressures would force the truth into the open. And it as working. Slowly but surely, the psychological consequences of her deception were becoming apparent, not just to me, but to those around her. Friends and family began noticing subtle inconsistencies, small hesitations, and nervous behaviors that didn't align with the image she had carefully maintained. Her anxiety increased with every interaction, her confidence waned, and the mask she had relied on for so long was starting to slip. I realized that the power of this approach lay not in confrontation, not in accusations, not in dramatic revelations, but in the quiet, persistent pressure that made truth unavoidable. I wasn't forcing her to confess. I was creating an environment where her own actions, patterns, and reactions would eventually make the betrayal undeniable to everyone. By the end of the second week in this phase, I could see the transformation. She was no longer entirely in control. Her composure faltered in subtle ways. Her confidence was undermined by the cumulative effects of these quiet consequences, and I could sense the inevitability of the upcoming reveal. It was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. The psychological tension was reaching a peak. She was increasingly aware, subconsciously, that something was wrong, that the facade she had relied on for so long was failing. But she still didn't know how much I knew, and that ignorance was crucial. I continued to guide situations subtly, ensuring that the ultimate revelation would be inevitable and irrefutable. And all the while, I maintained my calm exterior. Smiles, gestures, and casual conversations were carefully calibrated to keep her unsuspecting while allowing the consequences of her actions to manifest naturally. Each day, each subtle interaction, each minor slip contributed to the crescendo of psychological pressure that would lead to the climax. The final pieces were falling into place. The foundation of subtle consequences, the careful observation of patterns, and the orchestration of indirect witnesses had created a world in which the truth could no longer be denied. She was unraveling, and the inevitability of exposure was approaching. I knew then that the stage was set. The psychological tension, the cumulative consequences, and the careful observations had built a momentum that could not be stopped. The final act was near, and when it came, the truth would be undeniable, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through clarity, evidence, and the quiet, persistent power of reality itself. And I waited, calmly, patiently, knowing that the moment of revelation, when it finally arrived, would leave her, and everyone who had witnessed her deception, utterly speechless. The time had come to escalate. Months of subtle observation, patient testing, and careful orchestration had brought me to a pivotal point. I knew the truth. She knew, in some corner of her mind, that I was no longer blind, and now it was time to confront the lingering presence that had haunted our lives. Him, the man she had never truly left. This was not about revenge in the sense of aggression. It was about clarity, exposure, and finally closing the circle of betrayal that had been quietly poisoning my life. I remember the day I made the decision. It was quiet, a Sunday afternoon, with the city outside glowing under soft sunlight. I sat alone in the living room, reviewing every detail I had collected, the messages, the subtle slips, the hesitant expressions, the inconsistencies in her stories. I could see her duplicity from every angle, and I knew that confronting him directly, carefully, strategically, was necessary. But I also knew it had to be done in a way that would leave no room for manipulation, no space for denial, no opportunity for her to twist the narrative. The first step was preparation. I had to understand him, his patterns, and the ways in which he had influenced her life. I reviewed everything I knew about their interactions, cross-referenced dates and events, and began constructing a subtle trap that would allow the truth to reveal itself naturally. This wasn't about aggression. It was about creating a scenario in which he, too, could no longer hide, could no longer deny, could no longer manipulate. I approached him indirectly at first. A casual meeting, framed as a neutral conversation about mutual interests. Nothing that could raise suspicion. I watched him closely, noted his body language, listened to every word, every pause, every laugh. It became clear quickly. He had no idea that I knew, had no clue that the web of deception they had spun was beginning to unravel around them both. That ignorance was my advantage. During the conversation, I maintained complete composure, smiling, calm, casual, like any ordinary acquaintance. Yet behind my eyes, behind my calm exterior, I was fully aware of every subtle slip he made, every word he used to describe past interactions, every slight hesitation when he mentioned her. It was like watching a man dance on thin ice, unaware of how fragile his footing had become. I began testing reactions. Small, seemingly innocuous questions about shared memories, past events, and trips they had taken together. Every answer, every hesitation, every carefully crafted sentence he offered became data. I was piecing together not just their history, but also the layers of deceit that had affected my life, and that I intended to finally expose. Meanwhile, she remained unaware of my proximity to him, of the careful orchestration behind every interaction. She continued her routines, her subtle messages, her carefully hidden communications. And every time she thought she was safe, I was quietly observing, cataloging, waiting for the right moment. The psychological pressure I had been building for months was now about to collide with reality. I recall the first direct confrontation vividly. It was evening, a neutral location, neither his territory nor mine. The lighting was soft, the air calm, the world unaware of the storm about to unfold. I approached him casually, greeted him warmly, and engaged in light conversation, all while noting every detail, his posture, his tone, his eyes, the subtle indications of stress or confidence. And then I began weaving in subtle references to moments only he and she shared. His reaction was immediate but controlled, a slight tightening of the jaw, a brief flicker of anxiety in his eyes, a momentary hesitation in speech. He attempted to remain casual, to laugh it off, to downplay the significance of my words, but I had already observed too much, and I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to ensure that when the time came, the truth would be undeniable. As the conversation progressed, I introduced more specific references, minor events, shared memories, even small interactions that he might have assumed were private. Each mention was calculated, designed to provoke reactions without triggering defensiveness that could allow him to manipulate the narrative. He tried to remain calm, but the subtle cues were unmistakable: micro-expressions, slight shifts in posture, involuntary gestures. Every reaction confirmed what I had already suspected. He had underestimated me, as had she. I left the conversation without confrontation, letting the interaction simmer. It wasn't necessary to accuse him, to demand explanations, or to provoke a defensive response. The psychological pressure, carefully applied over months, combined with the subtle exposure during our meeting, was enough. He had been drawn into a reality where deceit could no longer remain hidden, and the cracks were visible, even if he refused to acknowledge them consciously. The next days were crucial. I continued my quiet observation, monitoring both of them: her subtle behaviors, his reactions, their interactions with the outside world. I noted the changes: fleeting glances, nervous touches, sudden silences, moments of hesitation. Each observation reinforced the reality I had been constructing. Their secret was no longer safe. Their lies were unraveling, and the inevitable confrontation, whether direct or indirect, was approaching. I also began preparing subtle exposures through social channels, arranging casual encounters where mutual friends or acquaintances might witness inconsistencies or suspicious behaviors. I didn't manipulate anyone overtly. I simply orchestrated the environment in which reality would naturally reveal itself. The subtle consequences I had been building for months now extended beyond our immediate interactions, reaching into their social circles in ways they couldn't control. There was one particularly telling encounter. I had arranged to meet a mutual friend at a cafe, knowing that she would also be present, casually interacting with him. The conversation flowed naturally, yet I introduced small references to past events that had been misrepresented in her stories. Her reaction was subtle but undeniable: a slight tightening of the lips, a flicker of panic in her eyes, a nervous glance toward him. He too displayed signs of discomfort, a brief hesitation before responding. The web of deception was beginning to strain under the weight of observation. Over the following week, I continued these orchestrations, carefully layering subtle pressure points, psychological nudges, and indirect exposures. I observed their interactions, noted every slip, and allowed reality to assert itself. The tension was palpable, even if no one outside our inner circle fully realized it. Their carefully constructed illusions were beginning to unravel in slow, deliberate increments, each one pushing them closer to inevitable revelation. I realized then the power of cumulative pressure. It wasn't a single confrontation or a dramatic accusation that would expose them. It was the consistent, patient application of observation, subtle nudges, and quiet psychological stress. Every small slip, every hesitation, every unconscious gesture had been building toward this moment, and now the pieces were falling into place. One evening, as I observed them from a distance during a casual gathering, I noticed a particularly revealing moment. She glanced at him in a way that betrayed hidden affection, yet also flickered with anxiety. He responded almost instinctively: a subtle touch, a fleeting glance, a whispered word. To anyone else, it would have seemed ordinary, even trivial. But I saw the underlying tension, the truth beneath the surface, and the undeniable connections that revealed the depth of their ongoing entanglement. I began planning the next step carefully. The goal was not confrontation for the sake of confrontation. It was exposure, clarity, and the undeniable unveiling of truth. I wanted their duplicity to be visible, to ripple through social circles, to create a reality they could no longer manipulate. And I knew that timing was critical. Any misstep, any premature action, could undermine the impact, dilute the clarity, or give them an opportunity to recover. I spent nights preparing, reviewing every detail, imagining scenarios, anticipating reactions. Every conversation, every observation, and every subtle exposure had been leading to this point. The culmination of months of strategic planning, patient observation, and psychological subtlety would soon arrive, and when it did, it would be undeniable. Undeniable not through drama, not through anger, but through the quiet, persistent power of reality itself. The next encounter with him was meticulously planned. I arranged a meeting under the guise of casual conversation, neutral territory, a setting where both of us could appear relaxed and unsuspecting. The subtle psychological pressure I had been building for months ensured that every word, every gesture, every reaction would contribute to the ultimate exposure. From the first words I observed, cataloged, and assessed, his initial casual demeanor began to shift almost imperceptibly. The tension in his shoulders, the slight falter in his speech, the nervous glance at her, all indicators of the unraveling process I had meticulously orchestrated. I allowed him to speak freely, to reveal small truths unknowingly, and noted every detail. Throughout the interaction, I maintained calm, precision, and patience. I smiled, nodded, and allowed the conversation to flow naturally, all while quietly steering it toward topics that would highlight the truth. Each subtle reaction he displayed, each micro-expression, each hesitation added to the growing clarity I had been cultivating for months. By the time the meeting concluded, I had everything I needed: the psychological groundwork, the subtle pressures, the careful orchestration of interactions. All had converged to create a scenario in which the truth would emerge unmistakably. Their duplicity, once hidden, was now exposed to reality in ways they could neither deny nor manipulate. I left the meeting calmly, composed, and quietly confident. The stage was set. The subtle tensions, the cumulative pressures, and the orchestrated interactions had created a world in which the inevitable reveal was unavoidable. The next phase, the ultimate confrontation and exposure, was near, and I felt the quiet anticipation of a story reaching its climax. The day had finally arrived. Months of observation, subtle tests, careful planning, and psychological pressure had built toward this moment, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden, when the veil of deception would finally be lifted. I could feel it in the air, the tension vibrating quietly like a storm on the horizon. Everyone would see the cracks that had been there all along, but only now would the full picture emerge in stark, undeniable clarity. I had orchestrated everything meticulously. The setting was a small gathering at our home, a mix of friends, family, and mutual acquaintances who had unknowingly been part of the subtle web of observation I had created. The atmosphere appeared normal, casual, even cheerful. No one suspected the drama that had been quietly building for months. But beneath the surface I felt a quiet surge of anticipation. Every detail had been considered, every move calculated, and now the final act was about to unfold. She arrived smiling as always, still confident, still thinking she had maintained control. She didn't know that every subtle slip, every hesitation, every micro-expression had been documented, observed, and collected. She didn't know that friends and family had seen inconsistencies too, that the subtle psychological pressures had begun to show tangible effects. She believed she was safe, that she could continue hiding behind her carefully crafted facade. She was wrong. I greeted her warmly, holding the appearance of calm and affection that had been my shield for months. To the outside world, everything seemed normal. But inside, I was focused, attentive, ready to allow the truth to surface naturally. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to accuse. I didn't need to confront aggressively. The moment had been set in motion, and reality would do the rest. The evening began innocuously, with small talk, laughter, and casual conversation. I subtly steered the dialogue toward past events, shared experiences, and mutual acquaintances, moments where her stories had inconsistencies, moments where her behavior had betrayed her. I observed her closely, noting the micro-expressions, the nervous gestures, the slight pauses in speech. Every detail reinforced the narrative I had been quietly building for months. Then I introduced the subtle catalyst, the one that would make her realize, finally, that her secrets could no longer remain hidden. A mutual friend mentioned an event, something she had described differently to me, and I allowed the comment to linger, letting the silence speak. Her eyes flickered, a faint blush appeared on her cheeks, and her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She glanced at me, searching for a reaction, but I remained calm, composed, and quietly observant. The subtle pressure intensified. I continued the conversation, weaving in references to trips, conversations, and interactions she had misrepresented. I did not accuse. I simply allowed the inconsistencies to surface naturally. Friends began asking questions, making observations, drawing connections without realizing the significance. She tried to maintain her composure, laughing, redirecting topics, forcing casualness into her tone, but the cracks were widening and the tension in her posture, her gestures, and her expressions became increasingly apparent. It was mesmerizing in a way. Watching someone unravel without confrontation is an intricate dance, a careful balance between patience, observation, and strategic guidance. She was trapped in the web of her own making, and now, surrounded by people who had witnessed subtle inconsistencies, the inevitability of exposure was manifesting. The psychological pressure I had built for months now bore tangible results. I decided to escalate the subtle exposure further. I introduced small, deliberate prompts, mentioning moments she had shared with him, casually referencing past events she had misrepresented, and weaving observations that friends and family could notice. Each comment, each question, each reference created a ripple, a tension that grew quietly but inexorably. Her anxiety became increasingly visible, though she tried to mask it. I could see the micro-tremors in her gestures, the quick shifts in posture, the subtle avoidance of eye contact. Then came the pivotal moment, the moment that would make the deception undeniable. I referenced a series of events she had described differently to different people, carefully linking them with observations made by friends and family. The weight of the inconsistencies became apparent, the web of lies collapsing under the combined power of subtle exposure and collective observation. Her facade faltered, her confidence shook, and her attempts at casual explanation were met with raised eyebrows, questioning glances, and silent scrutiny. She realized, finally, that her world was unraveling. Every carefully constructed lie, every hidden connection, every misrepresented story was now exposed, not through confrontation, not through accusations, but through clarity, observation, and the undeniable pattern of truth. The room, which had seemed ordinary moments before, now carried an electric tension. People were noticing what she had tried so hard to hide. She could feel it too, the realization that control had slipped from her hands, that her deception could no longer endure. I observed quietly, allowing the truth to surface in its own natural rhythm. She tried to explain, to redirect, to smooth over the inconsistencies, but the evidence was overwhelming. Friends began piecing together events, asking questions that highlighted contradictions, creating an environment in which denial was impossible. Her subtle attempts at manipulation faltered under the collective weight of reality. She had underestimated the power of observation, patience, and psychological strategy. At one point, I looked directly at her, maintaining a calm exterior, allowing the silence to speak. Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of fear and understanding passing across her face. She realized, in that moment, that her world had shifted irrevocably. The lies, the hidden messages, the duality of her life, it was all laid bare, exposed not by my anger, not by dramatic confrontation, but by the quiet accumulation of months of careful observation and subtle orchestration. The tension reached its peak when a mutual acquaintance asked about a trip they had all taken together, a trip she had claimed was shared only with me. The hesitation in her voice, the slight stumble in her explanation, and the nervous glances at me and others revealed everything. Friends exchanged knowing looks, subtle nods, and quiet questions. The room, once casual and ordinary, became charged with the undeniable presence of truth. It was at that moment that I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not triumph, not malice, but clarity. The truth, which had been carefully hidden, was now visible to everyone. Her duplicity, once a secret, had been exposed through the persistent, patient application of observation, subtle pressure, and orchestrated social dynamics. There was no way to deny it, no way to manipulate perception, no way to reclaim the illusion she had maintained for so long. She slumped slightly in her chair, the tension in her body evident, the confidence she had carried for months evaporating in a wave of quiet realization. I remained calm, composed, and silent, letting the natural consequences of her deception unfold. The moment was delicate, almost poetic, a testament to the power of strategy, patience, and observation over brute confrontation. By the end of the evening, the exposure was complete. Friends and family understood the inconsistencies, the hidden connections, and the reality she had tried to conceal. She had been brought face to face with her own deception, her own duplicity, and the undeniable truth of her actions, and I had achieved the goal I had set months ago, to ensure that the betrayal she had relied upon for so long could no longer remain hidden. In the days that followed, the effects of the revelation continued to ripple outward. Conversations became quieter, interactions more cautious, and subtle acknowledgments of the truth began to emerge. She no longer had the confidence to maintain the illusion. The subtle psychological pressures had taken their toll, and the cumulative effect of months of observation and orchestration had transformed the dynamic completely. I reflected on the journey quietly, understanding the power of patience, strategy, and subtlety. The most dramatic revelations are often not the loudest, not the most confrontational, but those that emerge naturally from careful observation, psychological insight, and quiet orchestration. The exposure had been complete, the truth undeniable, and the consequences had manifested without aggression or malice, only clarity. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Betrayal, when confronted with patience, strategy, and calm observation, cannot endure. The truth, persistent and relentless, will always surface. And when it does, it transforms not only the deceived and the deceiver, but everyone who has been part of the story. I sat quietly, reflecting on the months of preparation, the subtle maneuvers, and the culmination of the psychological strategy. The revelation had been effective, undeniable, and precise. No one could dispute it, no one could deny it, and she could no longer hide behind the illusions she had carefully maintained. In the quiet aftermath, I felt a mixture of emotions, relief, closure, and a profound sense of clarity. The betrayal that had once consumed me had been confronted, exposed, and resolved through a combination of patience, observation, and subtle orchestration. And though the journey had been long and emotionally taxing, the result was undeniable. The truth had emerged, and justice, in its quietest and most precise form, had been achieved. I'm Smith, and at 25, I thought I had it all: love, hope, a future with the woman I believed was mine. But sometimes, what looks like a dream is actually a trap. I remember the day I met her as if it were yesterday. Bright smile, sparkling eyes, and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Everyone told me she was perfect for me, and at 25 I was eager, maybe too eager, to believe in perfection. We met at a mutual friend's party. She stood in the corner, slightly hesitant, observing everyone with that calm composure that made you want to know her story. I don't know why, but I felt an immediate pull toward her, something I couldn't explain. I introduced myself, and she smiled, a small, subtle smile that lingered longer than it should have. From that moment, everything seemed magical. Every date felt like a scene from a movie. Long walks, late-night talks, laughter that felt like it could never end. I was falling completely. I didn't notice the little cracks at first, the quick glances at her phone, the subtle pauses when I asked about her past. I didn't see them, or maybe I didn't want to. Fast forward a few months, and I was completely certain she was the one. We talked about marriage, about building a life together. At 25, I thought I had found my soulmate. I wanted to believe in her, in us, in the promise of love that everyone talks about in stories and movies. Then came the day I proposed. I planned it meticulously. Her favorite restaurant, a soft melody playing in the background, a ring that I had saved for months to afford. She said yes, and in that moment, I felt invincible. I thought, finally, life had rewarded me with love. But here's the thing about love: it doesn't always come with honesty. A few weeks into our engagement, I began to notice things I couldn't explain. Late-night messages she would hide, phone calls she would brush off, moments when she seemed distant, lost in thought. I asked her about it once, and she smiled, said it was nothing, just stress at work. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I was blind. The wedding day arrived. I remember standing at the altar trying to steady my nerves, looking at her in her dress, every detail perfect, every movement graceful. She looked radiant, but there was something in her eyes that day, a flicker, almost imperceptible, that I failed to notice. The honeymoon should have been the happiest time of my life. Instead, it was when I began to see the truth, subtle hints, small whispers of things I couldn't yet name. She would receive messages and step away to respond. Sometimes I would notice her smiling at her phone in a way that didn't include me. My stomach twisted, but I pushed it aside. I told myself I was imagining things. Then, the day came when the illusion shattered completely. I found a message, one that wasn't meant for me. Or at least that's what she thought. It was from him, the man she had loved before me, the one she never really left behind. Reading those words, I felt the ground vanish beneath me. Betrayal isn't something you prepare for. It hits like a storm, sudden and merciless. Every memory, every smile, every promise felt tainted. My perfect life, the life I had built in my mind, crumbled. I confronted her that evening. I needed answers. I needed honesty. But what I got instead was a carefully constructed wall of excuses, half-truths, and silent admissions that spoke louder than words. She hadn't stopped loving him. She hadn't stopped thinking about him. And somehow, I was supposed to accept that as our life together. I didn't. That night, I made a choice. I could either let this destroy me, let her betrayal define the rest of my life, or I could take control. I could find a way to reclaim my dignity, to expose the truth, and to ensure that she and everyone around us understood the consequences of deceit. And that's when my plan began. But before I tell you what I did, you need to understand who I am and why I couldn't just walk away. My name is Smith, and I've always believed in fairness, in justice, not in revenge for revenge's sake, but in making things right when wrongs go unchecked. I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes. But when someone betrays the trust you've given them, it's a moment that defines who you truly are. And I realized, in that moment of heartbreak, that I had two choices: crumble or rise. I chose to rise. What happened next changed everything. The betrayal that cut me so deeply became the catalyst for a story I never expected, a story of patience, strategy, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of deceit. And so, my journey began. The days after that discovery were the hardest I've ever faced. I felt like I was walking through a fog, unable to see clearly, unable to trust anything, even my own thoughts. Every laugh, every touch, every word we had shared suddenly felt hollow. I kept asking myself, how could she do this? How could she betray me so completely? The pain was suffocating, and yet beneath it a fire began to burn, a fire of determination, of refusal to be broken. I started watching her more closely, not in a paranoid way, but in a way a man does when he knows the ground beneath him is unstable. She continued her daily routines as if nothing had happened, but I could see the cracks, the tiny hesitations, the glances she thought I wouldn't notice. There were moments when she would check her phone too quickly, hide a message too discreetly, or smile faintly at a memory she shouldn't have been thinking about. Each small action confirmed the truth I was trying not to fully accept: she still loved him. I remember one evening, sitting alone in the living room after she had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how my life had ended up like this. The ring I had given her now felt like a weight around my neck, a reminder of my own naivety. I thought back to our first meeting, to the way her eyes had drawn me in. How could I have been so blind to the signs? How could I have loved so completely and yet been so easily deceived? It wasn't just love I had lost, it was trust. Trust is such a fragile thing, and once it shatters, there's no way to glue it back together. I felt anger, yes, but more than anything, I felt a deep, hollow sadness. It was the kind of sadness that seeps into your bones, that makes the simplest tasks feel like climbing a mountain. Even eating, even sleeping, even walking felt like carrying a weight I couldn't put down. I realized I had two choices: succumb to despair and let this betrayal destroy me, or rise above it, learn the truth fully, and find a way to reclaim my life. I chose the latter. I knew the journey would be long, painstaking, and emotionally draining. But I also knew that the sense of powerlessness I felt had to end. I couldn't let her, couldn't let him, think they had won. The first step was understanding the full extent of the betrayal. I began quietly investigating, carefully observing patterns, noticing routines, and piecing together fragments of information she thought were hidden. It wasn't easy. I had to balance living my daily life, going to work, interacting with friends and family, while secretly gathering the pieces of a puzzle that was more painful than I had imagined. I found myself rereading old messages she had sent, trying to find hidden meanings or subtle hints I had missed. Every little detail mattered. I checked social media interactions, noted the times she would disappear, the places she claimed to go. Every lie she had told, every omission, slowly started forming a picture I wasn't proud to see, but one I had to confront. The shock of realizing how carefully she had hidden her feelings for him hit me again and again. I kept imagining them together, laughing, sharing moments I had once believed were only ours. My heart ached in ways I didn't think were possible. But pain, I discovered, can also be a teacher. It taught me patience. It taught me observation. It taught me that the world doesn't stop for betrayal, and if I wanted justice, I needed to act smartly, not impulsively. I began keeping notes, writing down observations, times, conversations, and inconsistencies. It felt methodical, almost clinical, but I knew that to regain control, I had to be precise. I couldn't rely on anger or impulsive decisions. I had to let strategy guide me. Each piece of information became a tool, each inconsistency a lever. I started to feel a strange sense of power returning to me. Not the power to hurt, but the power to see clearly, to understand fully, and to prepare for what would come next. There were moments, though, when the sadness returned like a wave, pulling me under. I would sit at the window late at night, staring at the streetlights, thinking about what could have been. The dreams I had built in my mind, the life we could have had, the family, the home, the laughter, felt stolen from me. I allowed myself to cry sometimes, to release the weight, because I knew that burying emotions would only make me reckless. But after the tears, I would rise again, more determined than ever. Then came the turning point, the moment when I realized that if I didn't act carefully, I might lose everything, not just her, but my sense of self. I couldn't let bitterness consume me. I couldn't allow revenge to become a hollow, destructive force. I needed a plan, subtle, undeniable, something that would expose the truth without me losing my integrity. I started by subtly testing her reactions, creating scenarios that might reveal her true feelings. I would bring up innocuous topics, places he loved, events they had shared, and observe her expressions, her hesitation, her tone. Each micro-expression, each pause, each flicker in her eyes told me more than words ever could. It was as if her mask was slipping in tiny fragments, and I was finally noticing. There were nights I barely slept, analyzing every detail of the day, every interaction. I spoke to mutual friends, carefully asking questions, listening to what they said and, more importantly, what they didn't. Slowly, the pieces of her secret world began to emerge. A world she had thought I would never see, a world built on lies and hidden loyalties. I realized that confronting her directly without preparation would be catastrophic. I had to move with precision. I couldn't just explode in anger or demand the truth. I had to let the revelations be undeniable, constructed in a way that would leave no room for denial. I had to give her, and everyone around us, a clear view of the consequences of deceit. And so, the plan began to take shape, not in haste but in careful, deliberate steps. I knew it would take weeks, maybe months. I knew patience would be my ally and observation my weapon. I knew that every small decision, every subtle move, had to align perfectly to bring clarity and justice without chaos. Even as I worked, the emotional toll was enormous. I questioned myself constantly, am I doing the right thing? Will this make me a better man or just a man consumed by anger? But each time I paused, I reminded myself why I had started. This wasn't about vengeance alone. It was about truth. It was about reclaiming my life from a deceit that had nearly destroyed it. By the end of those first weeks of careful observation, I had begun to see patterns, small but undeniable. There were times she would leave the room to take messages from him, times she would smile at something on her phone as though it were a secret joke I wasn't in on. Every detail confirmed what I already suspected. But more importantly, it gave me the confidence to act strategically. I wasn't going to let her betrayal define my story. I wasn't going to let her hidden love ruin the life I deserved. I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could shape the future, and that future depended on me being patient, smart, and deliberate. The fire that had first flared from heartbreak now burned with purpose. I wasn't just a man betrayed, I was a man preparing for clarity, for truth, for justice in a way that would leave no doubts, no shadows, no room for her to hide. And even as the pain lingered, even as the memories threatened to overwhelm me, I felt a strange calmness settling in, a calmness born of knowing I had a plan, a path forward, and a story that was about to unfold. This was only the beginning. What she didn't know, what everyone didn't yet see, was that I had stepped into a new version of myself, a version that wouldn't be broken, wouldn't be fooled, and would ensure that the truth, finally, would be seen by all. I knew that confronting her directly, without proof or preparation, would be a disaster. Anger alone wouldn't bring justice. It would only give her room to hide, to twist the story, to paint me as the irrational one. I had to be meticulous. Every move, every word, every glance needed to count. I had to expose the truth without giving her a chance to deny it. And that's when I began to play the long game. I started with subtlety. At first it was little things, casually asking about her day, watching her reactions when I mentioned places she had gone, or people she had seen. I learned to read micro-expressions, to catch the slight pause, the tension in her voice, the flicker in her eyes. It wasn't easy. I had to act as though everything was normal, as though I had no suspicion at all. My life became a delicate balancing act, smiling during the day, planning by night, all while hiding the storm inside me. I remember one evening in particular. She came home, glowing with that same smile she always carried when she was excited about him, and I pretended ignorance. "How was your day?" I asked casually. She hesitated for a split second, a pause I would never forget, before launching into her usual description of work and errands. But I noticed it, the way her hand trembled slightly when she put down her keys, the way her eyes darted at her phone across the room. It was a tiny crack in her armor, but it was enough. From there, I began keeping careful notes. Every message she received, every phone call, every unusual outing, it all went into a journal I carried with me. Some might call it obsessive, but I called it survival. I wasn't trying to punish her in that moment. I was trying to understand, to map the web she had woven around me. The more I observed, the clearer it became. She was trying to live two lives simultaneously, and in doing so, she had left traces I was determined to follow. Then I started planning little tests, almost invisible traps. I would casually bring up him in conversation, not accusatory, just stories or questions, as if I were talking about someone I barely knew. I watched her reaction closely. Every twitch, every hesitation, every forced laugh told me something. I saw her anxiety grow in ways she couldn't hide. It was subtle, but the imbalance it created in her carefully curated world was exactly what I needed. I also began to engage with her friends, not in an obvious way, but quietly, through small conversations. I asked questions about events, about past relationships, about things she had mentioned casually. People let details slip without realizing it. I wasn't interrogating them, I was listening, piecing together the story she had thought was hidden, and every detail I collected built the foundation for what was coming. One night, as I sat alone in our living room, reviewing my notes, I realized how deep the betrayal went. It wasn't just emotional, it was calculated. She had maintained a connection with him through small, carefully timed gestures, texts that seemed innocuous but were charged with meaning, subtle updates on her life that she never shared with me. And all the while, she smiled at me, held my hand, whispered promises of love that were empty. The anger I felt was tempered by a strange clarity. This was no longer just heartbreak, it was strategy. I had to move carefully. Any sudden exposure, any hint that I knew too much, would make her defensive, would give her an advantage. The truth had to come out in a way that left no room for denial. And I began crafting that approach, step by step. I also realized that the emotional toll was immense. I would spend hours pacing, staring out the window, imagining the confrontation I would one day orchestrate. I replayed scenes in my mind, Her reaction when the truth was undeniable, the silence, the shock, the realization that she could no longer manipulate the narrative. I allowed myself brief moments of anger, letting it fuel my focus, but I never let it take control. My goal wasn't revenge in the sense of destruction. It was exposure. It was truth. It was reclaiming the life she had attempted to corrupt. Meanwhile, she remained unaware. To everyone else, we were the perfect couple. We laughed at dinner parties, held hands in public, exchanged messages that looked tender. She believed she had fooled the world, and in a way, she had. But I had begun to see behind the mask. Every smile, every touch, every affectionate word became data. Information I could use to understand her patterns, to anticipate her moves, to plan the perfect exposure. I even started testing her trust. Small experiments, leaving my phone where she could see it, observing what she did with it. I would mention things she thought I didn't know, just to see if she flinched, if she adjusted her story, if she lied in a moment of instinct. The results were consistent. She couldn't hide everything, no matter how carefully she tried. The cracks were there, and I could see them, one by one, like pieces of a puzzle revealing a portrait of deception. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation she didn't know I was listening to. She spoke on the phone, quietly. At first, then more urgently. Words I wasn't supposed to hear slipped through, plans to meet, casual mentions of memories with him, laughter that wasn't mine. I felt a pang of hurt, but also a surge of resolve. That was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining things. The betrayal was real, ongoing, and deliberate. At that point, I knew I had to be patient. Patience became my secret weapon. I had all the pieces, but timing was everything. Exposed too early, and she could spin a story, manipulate friends, twist facts. Wait too long, and she might grow more reckless, perhaps even damaging my life further. I had to strike at the right moment, when the truth would be undeniable, when everyone would see the picture as clearly as I did. I began documenting everything meticulously. Every call, every message, every outing was recorded, sometimes mentally, sometimes in small, discrete notes. It was painstaking work and exhausting, but it was also empowering. I felt my strength returning piece by piece. I was no longer just a man betrayed. I was a man preparing to reclaim his life, to bring clarity to the chaos she had created. And through it all, I maintained the facade of normalcy. I smiled at her, held her hand, spoke gently when needed, laughed when others were around. No one suspected a thing. She thought she had me fooled, that I was still the naive, trusting man she had always known. But inside, I was a different man, observant, calculating, patient, and ready. The weeks turned into months, and the subtle dance continued. She grew more confident, thinking I was blind to her ongoing connection with him. She underestimated me. Every secret meeting, every whispered message, every hidden smile was catalogued, remembered, and stored. And with every passing day, my plan grew clearer. I wasn't just preparing to confront her. I was preparing to dismantle the web she had built, to reveal the truth in a way that would leave no room for lies. And I knew one thing: when the moment finally came, it wouldn't just be shocking for her, it would be unforgettable for everyone who had witnessed the deception, who had been unknowingly caught in the middle. That was the power of patience, of observation, of strategy. Betrayal is destructive, yes, but when confronted with clarity, it can be exposed, understood, and brought to justice without a single word of confrontation thrown in haste. And so, I waited. I watched. I collected every piece of evidence she unwittingly provided. Every smile she gave to him, every hidden message, every little slip became part of a larger story. A story that I would one day tell. A story that would leave her, and everyone around us, speechless. This phase of planning, of careful observation, became almost an obsession, but it was necessary. Because I knew that when the right moment arrived, everything would change. I would no longer be the man in love who had been deceived. I would be the man who exposed the truth, who reclaimed his life, and who ensured that the betrayal she thought she had hidden would be undeniable to all. And that's where I was, months into my silent investigation, patiently building the foundation for a revelation that would shake not just her, but everyone who had thought they knew the truth. Months had passed since I first uncovered her secret, and every day felt like walking on a tightrope. She continued her routine, completely unaware of how much I knew. To the outside world, everything was perfect. To me, every smile, every laugh, every whispered word was a piece of evidence. And I was ready to start using those pieces, not recklessly, not with anger, but strategically to reveal the truth in a way she could never deny. I remember the first time I tested the boundaries of her secrecy directly. It wasn't aggressive, it was subtle, like a shadow brushing across her world. One evening, she returned home later than usual. I had been expecting her, pretending to be immersed in a book, casually sipping a drink, watching as she walked through the door. The moment she entered, I noticed the slight blush on her cheeks, the hurried way she slipped her phone into her pocket. Her body language betrayed a tension she thought I wouldn't see. I let her settle, let the air between us remain calm, then casually mentioned a place she had claimed to visit earlier that week. Her hesitation was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The way her eyes flickered, the way her smile faltered, confirmed what I already knew. She was lying. And lying to me wasn't enough anymore. She had to be exposed in a way that couldn't be ignored. I started crafting scenarios that would encourage her to reveal herself without realizing it. I began with mutual friends, those she thought were oblivious to her duplicity. I arranged casual dinners, coffee meetups, small gatherings, all under the guise of social normalcy. I observed carefully, asking questions indirectly, mentioning events, places, and people that were connected to him. I noticed the small tells, quick glances, subtle shifts in posture, the way she almost stumbled over her words. The mask she wore around the world was cracking, and I was patient enough to watch it crumble slowly. Then came the subtle exposures. I started dropping hints in conversations, seemingly random, about people from the past, about her old life, about the very places and memories she thought I had ignored. Her reactions were priceless, quick, involuntary, almost panicked. She laughed when she shouldn't have, paused when she wanted to speak, and her eyes betrayed fear. It was as if she was realizing deep down that the web she had built was no longer invisible. One particularly tense evening, I set up a scenario that would leave no room for deception. I invited a few close friends over for dinner, people who knew us both well but who had never witnessed the undercurrents of our relationship. I made sure she was relaxed, unaware of the psychological minefield that was being carefully laid out. During the conversation, I casually mentioned a vacation she had taken months before, a trip she had claimed was entirely with me, but that I knew included him for at least one day. The pause was immediate. She smiled, trying to hide it, but I could see the subtle flicker of panic. Her hands tightened around her glass. Her voice wavered for a moment before she forced it back into composure. I let it pass, said nothing, allowing the silence to do its work. Others noticed it too, the slight tension, the uncertainty, but she tried to laugh it off, to mask it. And that was exactly what I wanted, a glimpse of the truth she couldn't hide. Over the next weeks, I intensified my efforts. I started to carefully orchestrate moments where her lies would be challenged indirectly, without confrontation. I would ask about her day, mention subtle details, or recount events from the past. I paid attention to every response, every pause, every hesitation. Each tiny slip, each micro-expression became a piece of the puzzle. I was no longer just observing, I was collecting evidence, building a narrative that couldn't be ignored. There was one afternoon, particularly intense, when I followed her lead on an event she had planned with friends. She thought it was casual, that I had no idea, but I arrived early, pretending to be running errands nearby. I watched her interact with the group, carefully noting each subtle expression when certain topics came up. Mentions of him, shared jokes, fleeting references that only someone intimately involved would catch. Every glance, every laugh, every shift in posture told me more about the depth of her deception. But I had to remain calm. I had to maintain the image of the man in love, the man oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath our life. To do this, I had to control my own emotions, hide my pain, and act as though everything was perfectly normal. This was perhaps the most challenging part. Pretending to be blind, pretending to trust, while every fiber of my being was acutely aware of the truth. I also began using technology subtly, not to invade her privacy in an illegal way, but to ensure that I had records of interactions, patterns of behavior, and indisputable evidence. I noticed changes in her routine, times when she was more secretive, the way she tried to avoid me when certain messages arrived. I kept mental notes, meticulous logs, and little reminders that would help me construct the ultimate reveal. Then came the psychological play. I started dropping hints, seemingly innocent, that I knew more than I let on. A glance at a phone, a casual mention of a past event, a subtle question about her old friends. She reacted every time, slightly anxious, slightly defensive, subtly unsettled. It was like watching a chess game, each move carefully calculated, each response revealing a piece of the truth. And every day, the tension grew. I even involved some indirect allies without them knowing, friends who had known her longer, who had witnessed some inconsistencies, were subtly influenced by my questions and observations. They began noticing patterns themselves, comments made in passing, moments that didn't add up. Slowly, without a single accusation, the world around her started to see what I had already known. The psychological tension built gradually. She was confident, even smug at times, thinking she had managed to keep her secret life hidden. But beneath that confidence, I could sense the cracks forming, the subtle signs of stress. I watched her carefully, noting the moments when her mask slipped, the way she would unconsciously check her phone, the way she would tense when certain topics came up, the slight hesitation before answering. These were the signs of someone realizing, even subconsciously, that their world was about to shift. I remember a particular night when I confronted the reality of her duplicity in a quiet, personal moment. We were alone in our apartment, the soft hum of the city outside filling the room. I looked at her, smiled gently, and asked a simple question. "Do you remember that day in March?" She smiled, then hesitated, then nodded. That pause, that hesitation, was enough for me. I didn't accuse her. I didn't confront her. I just let the silence stretch, let the weight of unspoken truths hang between us. That moment, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of a new phase in my plan, the phase where exposure would no longer be avoidable. I also began carefully orchestrating moments where mutual acquaintances would unwittingly contribute to revealing the truth. Casual conversations, seemingly random observations, small questions about her past, all subtly guided the narrative. I wasn't manipulating people directly. I was setting the stage for reality to reveal itself. And reality, as it turned out, was far more powerful than any argument I could make. Her reaction to these subtle moves was fascinating. I could see it in her body language, the slight tension in her shoulders, the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way she sometimes hesitated mid-sentence. She was realizing, even if only subconsciously, that her world was no longer entirely under her control, and the realization seemed to terrify her more than any confrontation could have. I became almost obsessive in my attention to detail. Every message she received, every subtle glance, every tone of voice was cataloged in my mind. I noticed patterns in how she tried to hide her connections, how she avoided certain topics, how she would sometimes overcompensate with affection to distract from her secrets. Each observation became a tool, each slip a key to understanding the full extent of her betrayal. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, a scenario that would make the truth undeniable. I invited her to a dinner party, a gathering of close friends and family, people who had known us both for years. Everything was casual, normal, light conversation, laughter, small toasts. But I had planned subtle cues, small triggers that would bring out the reactions I needed. I brought up past events, places, and shared memories, carefully chosen, casually mentioned, like fragments of conversation that seemed harmless but carried weight. And as expected, her composure faltered. A slight blush, a quick glance at her phone, a nervous laugh, all signs I had been watching for months. The cracks were visible, unmistakable, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph, just clarity. The truth was surfacing. As the evening continued, I allowed the tension to build. I didn't accuse her, I didn't point fingers. I let her reactions speak for themselves. Guests noticed, too, not in a dramatic confrontation but in subtle ways. The nervous energy she exuded, the slight slips in her stories, the hesitation in her laughter, everyone could sense it, even if they didn't yet understand it fully. And that was perfect. By the end of the night, I had everything I needed: the patterns, the reactions, the undeniable evidence of her hidden world, all laid bare in a way she couldn't ignore, and in a way that no one could dispute. It wasn't dramatic or violent, it was quiet, precise, and completely inevitable. The web of secrecy she had relied on for so long was unraveling, thread by thread. And in that moment, I realized something important. The most powerful revelations aren't forced. They emerge naturally, from careful observation, from patience, from the subtle orchestration of reality itself. I wasn't acting out of vengeance, I was acting out of clarity. I wasn't trying to humiliate her, I was allowing the truth to shine through in a way that couldn't be hidden. The following days were a delicate dance. I continued my observations, carefully monitoring her interactions, noting every slip, every hesitation, every reaction. Each day, her confidence waned, replaced by subtle anxiety. She was realizing, consciously or unconsciously, that her secret life could no longer remain hidden. I began preparing for the next phase, the phase where the truth would be undeniable, exposed not through anger or confrontation, but through careful, precise revelation. This was the moment I had been waiting for months to create, the moment where the betrayal she thought she had hidden would become visible to all, and where the consequences would be clear, unavoidable, and absolute. I knew that patience had been my ally, observation had been my weapon, and now, with the pieces in place, I was ready to move forward, not with anger, not with hatred, but with strategy, clarity, and the quiet inevitability of truth. This was only the beginning, the stage was set, and when the reveal came, there would be no doubt, no escape, and no room for lies. The betrayal she had relied on for so long would be fully exposed, and I would finally reclaim the control she had tried to steal from me. The plan had reached a critical stage. I had observed, documented, and subtly tested every reaction, every pattern, every lie. I knew the truth, and she knew, in some corner of her mind, that I was no longer blind. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed allies, not willing ones, not people I could force, but unknowing witnesses, individuals who could observe the subtle cracks in her facade without realizing they were part of the reveal. And that's where her social circle and family became the next piece of my plan. I started with small, casual interactions, almost accidental in appearance. I invited her friends over for coffee or lunch, always keeping the tone light and normal, never hinting that I knew anything. Yet, during these gatherings, I carefully guided conversations in ways that would expose inconsistencies. Questions about past events, mentions of trips, references to mutual friends, they all served as subtle nudges. I wasn't accusing, I wasn't confronting. I was letting the truth reveal itself in the way that only reality can. Her friends, oblivious to my strategy, began to notice small discrepancies themselves. One would mention a detail she had omitted. Another would casually bring up an event she had described differently to them. Her explanations, subtle as they were, started to falter. I observed every reaction, noting how she shifted uncomfortably, how her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, how laughter sometimes came too quickly, too forced. It was fascinating, almost like watching a carefully constructed stage set slowly collapse under its own weight. I also began engaging her family, subtly and gently. Family members often notice things friends do not: the way someone glances, the unspoken tension, the small inconsistencies in behavior. I asked questions that seemed casual, innocuous, about past family gatherings, shared memories, even minor events that would highlight her duplicity. Their observations, though unintentional, became valuable pieces of the puzzle, and she had no idea that every casual remark, every passing comment, was feeding into the narrative I was constructing. There was one afternoon in particular that stands out. We had arranged a small gathering at my apartment, a few close friends and family members, nothing extravagant. I kept the atmosphere light, joking, sharing stories, laughing with everyone, all while carefully steering conversations toward topics that would expose her hidden world. I mentioned a location she had said she had visited with me, casually asking about the trip. Her response was immediate: a laugh, slightly strained, a quick glance at her phone. The tension was palpable, even to those who didn't yet know what was happening. As the evening progressed, I noticed her demeanor change subtly. She became more anxious, more guarded, her laughter more forced. Small comments from friends, questions about past events, casual reminders of shared experiences, seemed to unnerve her further. I allowed it to happen naturally, letting the inconsistencies speak for themselves. She was beginning to realize, consciously or subconsciously, that the net I had been weaving for months was closing in. At the same time, I continued to collect tangible evidence, not just emotional cues. Subtle documentation, careful observation, and meticulous notes became my arsenal. Every hidden message, every suspicious interaction, every seemingly innocuous deviation from routine was cataloged. I began creating a timeline of events that no one could dispute, a chronology that would eventually make the truth undeniable. Her friends, though unaware, were becoming inadvertent allies. They began noticing patterns I had observed weeks ago. The way she would check her phone in secret, the slight hesitation in her stories, the subtle changes in her behavior. I didn't have to tell them anything. Reality was doing the work for me, and I could see it in their expressions. The first hints of doubt, the faint flicker of confusion, the subtle realization that something wasn't as it seemed. One evening, I arranged a casual dinner at our apartment with her closest friends. I made it seem spontaneous, normal, even cheerful. As the night unfolded, I allowed topics to drift naturally toward past trips, shared experiences, and old memories. Her reactions were revealing. The tension in her shoulders, the quick smiles, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture. Every detail was a testament to the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. I didn't need to accuse her. The truth was speaking for itself. During these gatherings, I also introduced subtle psychological nudges. I mentioned past conversations or events she had claimed to forget, small details that only someone paying attention would notice. Her friends, unconsciously observing, would react, ask questions, or make comments that further exposed inconsistencies. She tried to maintain composure, tried to redirect attention, tried to smile and laugh convincingly. But the cracks were widening. There was a moment during one particular dinner that felt like a turning point. One of her friends casually mentioned a place she had visited recently, completely unaware of the significance. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause I noticed immediately, before offering a vague, hurried explanation. The subtle fear in her eyes, the tension in her voice, the faint flush in her cheeks, all of it confirmed what I had known for months. She was trapped in the web of her own lies, and the walls were closing in. I realized then the power of collective observation. While I could see her deception, others noticing, even subtly, made the eventual reveal more impactful. She had built her double life on the assumption that no one would notice, that people would accept her explanations without question. But by guiding situations subtly, allowing friends and family to witness inconsistencies naturally, the foundation of her lies was beginning to crumble. At the same time, I maintained the appearance of normalcy with her. I smiled, laughed, and acted as though I trusted her completely. My calmness, my composure, was part of the strategy. If I had let anger or despair show, she might have become defensive, more secretive, more careful. By remaining calm, I ensured that she continued her patterns, unaware that each action she took was feeding into the story I was quietly documenting and orchestrating. There were nights I would sit alone after these gatherings, reviewing everything I had observed, noting small details that seemed insignificant at first. A glance, a tone of voice, a hesitation. Each became part of the puzzle. I began constructing the narrative in my mind, a story that, when finally revealed, would leave no room for denial. It wouldn't rely on confrontation. It would rely on clarity, evidence, and the natural consequences of her actions. I also began noticing patterns in her behavior outside of our interactions. Subtle messages on social media, slight changes in routine, casual mentions of past events, everything pointed to the same truth I had already seen. She was living a double life, and it wasn't sustainable. The more she tried to maintain the illusion, the more obvious it became to Hose paying attention. One particular evening, I orchestrated a small, seemingly innocent gathering with friends and family. The atmosphere was relaxed, laughter filled the room, and I kept the tone casual, warm, and inviting. But I subtly introduced topics that would challenge her stories, nudging conversations toward events and interactions where her hidden loyalties might slip through. Her reactions were immediate: hesitation, fleeting nervousness, slight inconsistencies in speech. I allowed it to unfold naturally, never accusing, never confronting, simply observing. By the end of the evening, I could see the change in her demeanor. The confidence she had once exuded was faltering. Small hints of anxiety flickered in her eyes. Her movements became more cautious, her laughter less spontaneous. She had begun to realize, even if only subconsciously, that her secret life could no longer remain hidden. At this point, I knew I had the foundation for the next phase, the moment when the truth would be undeniable, exposed not through anger, confrontation, or dramatic scenes, but through clarity, evidence, and the natural consequences of her actions. I had created an environment where reality itself would reveal the deception she had tried to hide for so long. As the weeks continued, I carefully maintained this balance. I observed, documented, and subtly guided interactions, ensuring that her social circle and family were unwitting participants in the revelation. I continued to act as the calm, loving husband, masking the storm that had been brewing inside me for months. Every smile, every laugh, every affectionate gesture was carefully measured, maintaining the illusion while reality quietly did its work. And then came a pivotal moment, a small gathering that would mark the beginning of the unraveling, a casual dinner, seemingly normal, but orchestrated with precision. Friends mentioned past events she had told differently. Minor details emerged that contradicted her stories, and her reactions were immediate and undeniable. She shifted uncomfortably, laughed too quickly, avoided eye contact, tiny cracks that spoke volumes. I watched silently, calmly, allowing the truth to manifest without a word from me. The more she tried to maintain her composure, the more the inconsistencies revealed themselves, and in that moment, I knew the final phase was approaching. The stage was set, the evidence was clear, and the subtle network of allies, friends and family who had witnessed her slips, would soon confirm what I already knew: her deception could no longer remain hidden. This was the power of patience, observation, and strategic subtlety. I wasn't manipulating anyone, I was allowing the truth to emerge naturally. She had relied on the assumption that no one would notice, that her carefully constructed illusions would hold. But reality, carefully guided, was more powerful than any confrontation, more revealing than any accusation. And so I continued. Every day, every interaction, every subtle exposure brought us closer to the moment when the betrayal she had depended on would be undeniably revealed. I was patient, I was strategic, and I was calm, because I knew that when the final reveal came, it wouldn't just be shocking, it would be undeniable, and there would be no way for her to hide, no way for anyone to dispute the truth. After the revelation, the atmosphere was heavy with quiet tension. The truth had settled like a weight on everyone in the room. She no longer had the confidence to maintain her mask. The carefully constructed facade she had relied on for months had crumbled, and the ripple of awareness had spread to friends and family who had witnessed her subtle slips over time. The betrayal that had once consumed me had been exposed, and now the aftermath began to take shape. I sat back, observing the effects of what had unfolded. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from one person to another, searching for a foothold, a way to recover. But there was none. The subtle threads of deception she had used to control perception were gone. All that remained was clarity, the unspoken acknowledgement of the truth. Her shoulders sagged slightly, a faint tremor in her posture betraying the anxiety she felt. It was a moment of quiet reckoning, where she realized that the world she had tried to manipulate now saw her exactly as she was: deceptive, inconsistent, and exposed. Friends and family were hesitant at first, unsure how to react. Their expressions shifted between shock, curiosity, and cautious understanding. Some had noticed inconsistencies in the past, but seeing them come together, seeing the truth manifest, was a different experience altogether. And I watched it all silently, calmly, allowing the natural consequences of months of observation and subtle orchestration to unfold fully. The truth had taken on a life of its own, and there was no stopping it. She attempted to speak, to offer explanations, perhaps even apologies. But the words were weak, hesitant, and lacked conviction. Every attempt to reconstruct her narrative was met with subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement from those around her. Raised eyebrows, questioning glances, slight nods of recognition from friends who had pieced together the inconsistencies over time. Her attempts to regain control were futile. The story had already revealed itself, and everyone present could see it clearly. I felt a complex mix of emotions in that moment: relief, closure, and a quiet satisfaction. Relief that the truth was finally out, closure from the months of uncertainty, and satisfaction that the exposure had been achieved without aggression or dramatic confrontation. The process had been patient, deliberate, and strategic, and the outcome reflected that meticulous effort. It was not about humiliation or revenge, it was about clarity, understanding, and the restoration of balance. Over the following days, the subtle social consequences continued to manifest. Friends who had been part of the observations began to speak cautiously, sharing insights or asking questions that further reinforced the narrative of exposure. She found herself increasingly isolated, not because of public condemnation, but because the truth had created natural boundaries. People who had once been casual observers of her behavior now saw her in full light, understanding the depth of her duplicity without anyone needing to dramatize it. I, too, felt the weight of reflection. Months of subtle orchestration, observation, and psychological pressure had been taxing, not physically, but emotionally. There were nights I had lain awake, replaying interactions in my mind, analyzing micro-expressions, questioning every decision. I had to balance patience with action, observation with strategy, and calm composure with internal turmoil. And yet, through all that effort, I learned something profound about human behavior, trust, and the power of subtlety over aggression. She withdrew quietly over time. The confident, seemingly untouchable woman I had once married was now navigating the world with a new awareness of her own exposure. Every interaction was tempered by the knowledge that deception could no longer serve her. She had experienced the natural consequences of betrayal, and the impact was internal as much as external. The quiet unraveling had taught her, indirectly but profoundly, the limits of manipulation and secrecy. I began to reclaim my own life slowly. The months of heartbreak, observation, and subtle orchestration had taken a toll, but they had also strengthened me. I felt a renewed sense of clarity, purpose, and understanding. The experience had been painful, yes, but it had also been a lesson in patience, strategy, and the power of careful observation. I had learned that the most effective resolution is often quiet, precise, and undeniable, an outcome that allows truth to manifest fully without the need for theatrics or aggression. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. I continued my routines, engaged with friends and family, and allowed time to heal the emotional scars. She, meanwhile, navigated the social consequences of her exposure, learning firsthand the impact of her actions. And I reflected on the journey, understanding that the culmination of months of careful strategy had restored a sense of balance that betrayal had once disrupted. One evening, as I sat alone reflecting, I realized the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Betrayal had a way of consuming a person, of undermining trust and confidence. But when confronted with patient observation, subtle orchestration, and strategic clarity, betrayal could be exposed in a way that was undeniable, fair, and instructive. The truth had emerged, and the consequences had been realized without the need for destructive confrontation. I thought about the lessons learned, not just for her, but for me, for everyone involved. Trust is fragile, easily broken, and difficult to restore once compromised. Deception, no matter how carefully constructed, carries within it the seeds of exposure. And patience, observation, and strategy are powerful tools in restoring balance and revealing truth. As days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle changes in my own perspective. I was no longer consumed by anger or bitterness. Instead, I had a profound sense of clarity and understanding. The betrayal had been addressed, the truth revealed, and the psychological consequences had played out as naturally as I had orchestrated them. Life could move forward, not with resentment, but with a deeper awareness of human behavior, relationships, and the importance of integrity. I also began to see the social impact of the revelation. Friends and family, who had once been unaware of the depth of her duplicity, now approached interactions with a clearer understanding. The subtle network of observations and indirect exposures I had cultivated had ensured that the truth would remain evident and that the patterns of deception would no longer be tolerated. The subtle power of collective observation had become a natural corrective, reinforcing the lessons learned through months of patient strategy. She, in turn, had no choice but to confront her own actions. There was no public shaming, no loud confrontation, but the impact was undeniable. Her social standing, the trust she had relied upon, and the confidence she had carried were all diminished by the quiet but relentless exposure of her duplicity. The consequences were natural, fair, and irreversible. For me, the aftermath was a period of reflection and growth. I recognized the emotional toll the journey had taken, but I also acknowledged the lessons learned. Patience, subtlety, and careful orchestration could achieve outcomes that raw anger or aggression could never accomplish. Observing human behavior, understanding patterns, and allowing truth to reveal itself were powerful tools in restoring balance and integrity. I began to rebuild my own emotional landscape, slowly reclaiming confidence, trust in my judgment, and a sense of personal integrity. The betrayal, while painful, had served as a catalyst for growth. I had learned to observe, to strategize, and to act with precision. I had learned that the most effective outcomes often come not through confrontation, but through patience, subtlety, and clarity. Looking back, I understood that the climax, the revelation of betrayal, was only part of the journey. The aftermath, the subtle consequences, the reflection, and the emotional processing were equally critical. The story had reached its peak, yes, but the resolution lay in understanding the lessons it offered, and in rebuilding a life guided by clarity, observation, and emotional intelligence. In the quiet moments that followed, I realized something profound. Betrayal, when confronted with patience and subtle strategy, cannot endure. Truth has a way of surfacing, clarity has a way of asserting itself, and consequences, when applied subtly and strategically, can restore balance without malice or aggression. The months of preparation, observation, and subtle orchestration had culminated in a resolution that was both satisfying and instructive. I began to move forward with my life, carrying the lessons I had learned. Trust had been broken, yes, but the experience had strengthened my understanding of human behavior, relationships, and the quiet power of strategy. I approached interactions with renewed awareness, subtlety, and clarity. The emotional scars remained, but they were tempered by the knowledge that betrayal had been addressed, exposed, and resolved in a way that preserved integrity and fairness. In the end, the journey was not just about exposing deception, it was about understanding, observing it, and allowing the natural consequences to unfold. It was about reclaiming control, restoring balance, and learning the lessons that only experience can teach. And in that understanding, I found not just closure, but a renewed sense of purpose, clarity, and resilience. After months of tension, observation, and quiet orchestration, life had shifted. The revelation of her betrayal had rippled outward, leaving clarity and undeniable truth in its wake. Friends and family had witnessed inconsistencies, subtle psychological pressures had taken hold, and the reality of deception had been exposed. And now, as the dust settled, I found myself reflecting deeply on the journey, the months of pain, strategy, and patience, and the lessons it had left me with. I sat alone one evening staring out at the city lights, thinking about the man I had been when I first discovered the betrayal and the man I had become through this journey. At 25, I had entered marriage with love, hope, and a sense of innocence. I had believed in trust and faith, in the promise of a shared future. But betrayal had a way of breaking more than trust. It shattered confidence, altered perception, and left one questioning everything. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, I realized that this experience had transformed me profoundly. The first lesson was patience. In the heat of betrayal, the instinct is often to react impulsively, to confront with anger, to demand answers immediately. But I had learned that patience is far more powerful than confrontation. By observing quietly, documenting carefully, and orchestrating subtle exposures, the truth emerged with far greater impact than any emotional outburst could have achieved. The revelation was undeniable, methodical, and, most importantly, fair. I also learned the power of observation. Every tiny gesture, micro-expression, and hesitation carries meaning. People reveal themselves in ways they often don't intend, through subtle cues, small inconsistencies, and unconscious behavior. By paying attention, by truly seeing, I had gathered the pieces of the puzzle long before confrontation was necessary. Observation, I realized, is a weapon far stronger than words alone. Another lesson emerged from the role of subtlety. The most effective consequences are rarely loud or dramatic. They are quiet, incremental, and cumulative. Over weeks and months, the psychological pressures I had applied through careful orchestration had created a natural unraveling of deception. No one had to be shamed, accused, or humiliated. The truth revealed itself through the ordinary flow of life, guided by subtle nudges and observations. Subtlety, I realized, is often more powerful than force. I thought about the importance of strategy. Every interaction, every conversation, every observation had been part of a carefully constructed plan. I had balanced patience with action, calm composure with internal turmoil, and subtle guidance with observation. Strategy allows one to act with precision, to avoid impulsive decisions, and to create outcomes that are fair, clear, and undeniable. Without strategy, betrayal can lead to chaos. With strategy, it can lead to clarity. There was also a lesson in resilience. Betrayal wounds deeply, but it can also strengthen. The months of careful observation, subtle pressure, and patient orchestration had been emotionally taxing, but they had also forged a version of myself that was stronger, clearer, and more capable of understanding human behavior. Resilience is born not from avoidance of pain, but from confronting it with patience, intelligence, and quiet determination. I reflected on the role of empathy, not for her, but for myself. I had felt anger, hurt, and heartbreak, but I had channeled those emotions into strategy, observation, and patient orchestration. In doing so, I maintained my integrity while addressing the betrayal effectively. Understanding one's own emotions and channeling them constructively is a form of empowerment, a lesson in self-respect and personal growth. There was also insight into human behavior and trust. People lie, deceive, and manipulate, often unintentionally, often out of fear or desire. But deception is fragile, and the truth has a way of surfacing when observed carefully and strategically. Trust is precious, difficult to earn, and easily broken. Once broken, it requires patience, clarity, and understanding to navigate, whether in repair or closure. The final lesson, perhaps the most profound, was that justice need not be loud, vengeful, or destructive. True justice, I realized, is precise, patient, and fair. It allows the truth to reveal itself, lets reality assert its own consequences, and restores balance without unnecessary harm. The betrayal I experienced was addressed fully, yet I retained my dignity, clarity, and emotional integrity. Justice, in its quietest form, had been achieved. I thought about the subtle power of social context. Friends and family had played an unwitting but crucial role in the revelation. Collective observation, when guided subtly, can amplify the impact of truth. The presence of witnesses, even unknowing ones, ensures that deception is exposed not only privately, but also socially, reinforcing accountability. As I reflected, I realized that closure is not about dramatic confrontation or punishment. It is about understanding, reflection, and the reestablishment of balance. The months of preparation, subtle exposure, and patient orchestration had led to a moment of undeniable clarity. Closure arrived quietly, with the satisfaction of knowing that the truth had been revealed and that the consequences were natural, just, and irreversible. I also considered the emotional growth this journey had fostered. Betrayal had forced me to see human behavior with clarity, to understand patterns, and to navigate complex social dynamics. I had developed a sharper sense of observation, an increased capacity for patience, and the ability to act strategically without succumbing to raw emotion. Emotional intelligence, I realized, is forged in the fires of adversity. In the quiet aftermath, I began to reconstruct my life. Trust, confidence, and personal integrity were reclaimed, and I approached relationships, interactions, and decisions with a renewed sense of awareness. The scars of betrayal remained, yes, but they were tempered by understanding, reflection, and growth. Pain had transformed into insight, heartbreak into resilience, and deception into clarity. I also reflected on forgiveness, not necessarily for her, but for myself. Holding on to anger and bitterness would have consumed me, clouded my judgment, and undermined the strategic clarity I had cultivated. By allowing the truth to reveal itself and observing the consequences naturally, I was able to release the emotional burden of resentment. Forgiveness, I realized, is a tool for one's own clarity, not necessarily a gift to those who have wronged us. The culmination of this journey was more than personal victory. It was a profound understanding of human dynamics, relationships, and the quiet power of patience, observation, and strategy. Betrayal, while devastating, can be addressed effectively without resorting to aggression, dramatics, or malice. Clarity, evidence, and subtle orchestration are often more powerful than confrontation. As weeks passed, I saw changes in those around me. Friends and family interacted with renewed awareness, subtle tensions dissipated, and a quiet equilibrium was restored. She, meanwhile, had no choice but to navigate the social and personal consequences of her actions. The lessons of deceit, exposure, and clarity had left an imprint, ensuring that behavior and trust were recalibrated. Looking back, I realized that this experience had shaped the man I had become. I had entered at 25 full of hope and innocence, believing in trust and love unconditionally. I had faced betrayal that could have shattered me, but through patience, observation, subtle strategy, and reflection, I emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I had reclaimed my life, exposed the truth, and restored balance without resorting to destruction. The story, ultimately, is not about revenge. It is about clarity, justice, and personal growth. Betrayal tests us, challenges us, and forces us to confront reality in ways we may never have anticipated. But with patience, insight, and careful strategy, it is possible to navigate the storm, reveal the truth, and reclaim integrity, dignity, and emotional balance. As I sit now reflecting on the journey, I see it as a story of transformation. From heartbreak to clarity, from deception to exposure, from confusion to resolution, each step was a lesson. The betrayal that once consumed me has become a source of insight, teaching me about patience, strategy, observation, resilience, and the quiet power of justice. The moral is clear. Life will test trust, challenge relationships, and expose vulnerability. But the response defines the person. Through calm observation, careful orchestration, and strategic patience, it is possible to navigate betrayal with integrity, reveal the truth, and restore balance. The scars remain, but they are tempered by wisdom. The experience is painful, but it is instructive. And above all, the truth, persistent and undeniable, will always find its way to the surface. I have learned that clarity, justice, and personal growth do not require anger or malice. They require patience, strategic observation, and the courage to allow reality to reveal itself. And in that understanding, life moves forward, not with resentment, but with insight, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing truth prevail.